We are once again meeting at the national debate after a year. And this year gone by, I really don't know what to say. What hit us, how it hit us, what we thought, what happened, so much to talk about. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Calcutta Club, the Telegraph National Debate 2021. Presented by Subhas Bose Institute of Hotel Management, powered by the Calcutta Business School, a unit of Sri Shikshayatan Foundation, in association with Pan Bahar. Television news partner ABP Ananda, radio partner 91.9 Friends FM. Well, ladies and gentlemen, talking about 365 days before, the motion today is, during the pandemic, India failed to balance lives and livelihood. I'd just like to put a thought forward. I know we've gone through a lot. Lives turned upside down. Livelihood went underwater. But, as the saying goes, we found adequate time to be with our families, which I don't think we have ever been. We rediscovered ourselves. The earth grew a little more greener. Pollution was controlled in a big way. Animals and creatures which were never seen for a long time were on the streets or in the nearby forests. It just shows and it says something. But you know, the human race is always overpowering. They get through. Because exactly 100 years ago, if you remember, we went through the Spanish flu. And 100 years later, we are still, to some extent, facing the COVID menace. With that, ladies and gentlemen, once again a warm welcome. And I'd like to call on the President of the Calcutta Club, Dr. Parthasarathi Ghosh, to come on stage and deliver the welcome speech. Dr. Ghosh.
Friends, distinguished guests, panelists, ladies and gentlemen, a hearty welcome to this year's national debate. 2020 was a devastating year for humanity, causing unprecedented suffering, loss of life, and livelihood. This is, of course, not the first time that a pandemic has occurred. Human history is replete with such catastrophes. The lockdown versus no lockdown, that is, life versus livelihood debate, was sparked off by two academic groups, one based in the University of Oxford and the other in Imperial College London, where I had the great fortune of studying. Many countries opted for lockdown, as did India, though a bit late. After nearly a year, the so-called curve has flattened considerably, particularly in India. And luckily, vaccines are also already available. But still, COVID-19 won't go away. It is here to stay because it started mutating before the vaccines were available. Remember, smallpox took nearly a decade to eradicate, and polio is still around after 30 years of vaccination. Common cold is actually also a coronavirus, and we are all used to it. So we have to get used to COVID-19 as well. At the heart of life and its evolution is the interplay of chance and necessity. At the level of the DNA, random mutations occur. But its macro environment brings about an overall order. It is like our basic impulses, which are unruly, but our character subdues them into a harmonious whole. So with all living organisms, without this interplay of chance and necessity, life would not have evolved in its magnificent variety. So let us accept reality for what it is. Now, ever since the agricultural revolution about 10,000 years ago, the humans, that is the Homo sapiens, gradually gave up their nomadic behavior and started settling down in communities. The stability of these communities required a very complex social structure of interdependence, social bonding, and most importantly, the development of a sophisticated and evolving language. It is our language which gives us the ability to communicate. Social distancing has shattered this very basic necessity. Instead of advocating physical distancing and social integration, governments enforced social distancing. That has been disastrous. However, we are slowly but surely overcoming that by opening up our club cautiously and encouraging social integration and bonhomie. We don't come to the club only to eat and drink, but essentially for adda, which is in our bones. I still remember the occasion when I went with a friend to meet the great Satyajit Ray in the mid-60s to request him to address our group, which we called Dorbari. The first question he asked in his stentorian voice was, "Apnader addata kothay?" We were sheepish and said, no, sir, we don't indulge in addas. We are serious students. His immediate response was, "Na, adda chhada kichu hoy na." So there you are. A debate is a structured form of adda, enlivened by brilliant argumentation, humor, and repartee. We have a brilliant panel today, and I'm particularly happy to see 3 of our senior members on it. We all look forward to a great debate. I take this opportunity to thank the Telegraph and ABP Ananda profusely for sponsoring this important annual event, and also other sponsors such as Subhas Bose Institute of Hotel Management, Calcutta Business School, Pan Bahar, and 91.9 Friends FM. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to all of you all on this August and beautiful evening. You know, it's so nice to see everyone in their seats all ready to actually experience something which is going to be absolutely fantabulous. And anything to reach the fantabulous positioning, we definitely need an awesome, go-getting moderator. And of course, this evening's moderator, ladies and gentlemen, really needs no introduction. But I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just saying a little about him. Well, our moderator for this evening is Dr. Sandeep Chatterjee, academic coordinator at the Park Clinic, Kolkata, and professor and head of neurosurgery of VIMS, Kolkata. He is also the editor-in-chief of two new neurosurgical journals, apart from being an associate editor of 6 other global neurosurgical journals, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Chatterjee has over 170 scientific publications and 40 book chapters to his credit. He is also an avid photographer and a founder member of the Calcutta Debating Circle, in addition to serving as faculty for the European Society of Pediatric Neurosurgery and the Asia-Australian Society of Pediatric Neurosurgery. Dr. Chatterjee introduced microneurosurgery for the brain and spinal disorders in the private sector in Kolkata, when neither was available in the city 2 decades ago. He's also a faculty of the Academic College of Neurological Society of India, and currently also he chairs the Education Committee of the World for International Society of Pediatric Neurosurgery. Ladies and gentlemen, kindly put your hands together and a warm welcome to our moderator for this evening's debate, Dr. Sandeep Chatterjee.
Good evening and welcome to this, what promises to be a fantastic debate. The debate is as good as the debaters, and before I do anything else, it's my very pleasant duty to introduce to you and welcome on the dais the lady and gentleman who will enthrall you with their wonderful logic and dramatic deliberations. As per parliamentary custom, I am going to introduce and invite to the dais first the speakers speaking in favor of the motion, and again, according to custom, we will have them seated on my right. The first speaker speaking in favor of the motion happens to be a very senior advocate of the Supreme Court, a leading voice of civil rights, proved by the fact that he's had his Twitter account disabled twice, one who has appeared in the Nirbhaya case, and one who has been asked by the Honorable Supreme Court to talk to the protesters of Shaheen Bagh. Today he's going to talk to the Calcutta Club, and I welcome on stage Mr. Sanjay Hegde. The second speaker speaking in favor of the motion is a man who spent a large part of his life in Singapore, who is also an economist by profession, but he wishes to be remembered for his book of history, and he's author of a famous book called Asia Reborn, a modern history of the whole of Asia. Mr. Prasenjit Basu taught, predicted, and presented economies of Southeast Asia for many years while he was living in Singapore. He has now located to Delhi. But although he was a Singaporean by location, Mr. Basu has always been an Indian by heart. Because while he was in Singapore, he was president of the Singapore Tagore Club, and he was secretary of the Singapore India Club. Welcome to the stage, Mr. Prasenjit Basu. And, oh, sorry, yes, you are on that side. So what we'll do is we'll get one on each side. That will make it easier. Right. Speaking in favor of the motion speaking on the right side, is a colleague of mine, Dr. Kunal Sarkar. Most of you know Dr. Sarkar. He's a cardiac surgeon and he's a founder, president of the Calcutta Debating Circle. In his former role, he is very quick to get into the matter of the heart. In his latter role, he's quick to get into the heart of the matter. He works on the bypass, and that's what he does for a living as well. And currently, he's been speaking more on virology than cardiology. Welcome to the stage, Dr. Kunal Sarkar. Just to maintain the balance, I will call a speaker on the opposition next. And he's going to be the person who's going to be speaking first for the opposition. And he's a local boy from La Martiniere for school and St. Xavier's, La Martiniere School and St. Xavier's. A local boy who's now become the owner of a housing development firm, a few hotels, a university, and more recently a football club. He's a recipient of the Padma Shri Award, and he's gone on record as saying that 2021 will be a year of hope and betterment, for whom we will find out once the election results are out. Mr. Harsh Neotia, please. The third and final speaker speaking in favor of the motion is a lady who is an investment banker by profession, who has now invested in West Bengal politics. An economics graduate from Massachusetts who works in Krishnanagar. And since people have got into serious trouble for introducing her in a way she didn't approve of, I'm going to keep my introduction very brief and say that Mahua Moitra balances the best of Western education with her Eastern culture. Mahua Moitra, please. And I introduce the last speaker speaking against the motion, because I think amongst his other introductions, he is the most frequent member of the Calcutta Club. A professor of engineering who wants to be remembered about his book on history, a man who topped every examination in Shivpur Engineering College that he appeared for, and then ended up topping, I said topping, a lot of governments in northeastern India. A man who has great familiarity with the Calcutta Underground. That's only because he worked for the Metro Railway while it was being built. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome on the stage Mr. Tathagata Roy. It seems just a few days ago, or was it a year ago, when we were busy attending the Telegraph debate at this very venue in thousands. And we were busy attending public functions by the hundreds, crisscrossing in aeroplanes this planet of ours in thousands, tearing apart holes in the ozone layer of this planet by millions, and breathing unhealthy particulates in the air by billions, until there descended upon us a little blob of RNA, 0.1 microns in size, that was to 10 was to taunt our biological superiority and bring the human race down on its knees faster than a world war would have done. Imagine a race that sends men to Mars and mars the tranquility of the space with their arrogant achievements, trembling in fear of a virus. And while we debate about the effects of this virus, its effect on the biological versus the economic health of this nation, I think this evening and on this venue, it would not be out of place to rejoice that we are alive. But remember those who are not, and respect those that made the difference. And I propose to the members of the Calcutta Club that before we embark on a debate on the coronavirus, we should take a minute to remember 157,699 fellow Indians who have lost their lives due to this virus. And may I ask you to stand for a minute's silence in their honor. Thank you. One final comment before we get the debate live. It is customary for the moderator in any debate to mention the rules of parliamentary debating, particularly if you have parliamentarians in the debating panel. And I would mention to please remember to trample on the arguments of your opposition, but not on their toes. Please maul their message, but don't murder the messenger. And finally, you can keep your brickbats for their speeches. Please keep the bouquets for the speakers. And there is a new rule of parliamentary democracy that has been introduced in 2022, and I have great pleasure in proposing it to all of you. And that is, as per the norms of parliamentary democracy, only one person needs to speak at any one time, which means the rest of us can keep the masks on. Thank you for understanding this piece of medical advice. And I now request the first speaker speaking in favor of the motion, Mr. Sanjay Hegde, who has 10 minutes, and just before he goes up to the dais to speak, just to make sure that he and all his co-speakers do not spend more than 10 minutes at the lectern, we have a very strict lady called Mrs. Shormila Bose, who is going to join me on stage, and she's in possession of a perfect watch. Since the president of this club is a physicist, she does treat this very seriously as a fourth dimension to speeches. Mr. Hegde.
Good evening, Calcutta. It's a pleasure to be here. But it is also a solemn moment. And that solemn moment when we remembered 157,699 of us fellow Indians who did not survive the virus. And that number will probably have a few more additions. But each one of these individual Indians is much more than a statistic. It is said that the death of a single man is a tragedy, but the death of 1,500 people, 1,500,000 people is a mere statistic. And why is it a statistic? It is a statistic because sometimes we make the wrong decisions. Our leadership makes the wrong decisions. And the difference between the right decision and a wrong decision when faced with wars, with pandemics, means the difference between a few necessary lives lost and millions of lives lost. 50 years ago, almost to the very month, in April 1971, there was a decision to be made. Prime Minister of that day had in the month of March won a massive majority. But on 25th March 1971, the Pakistani army attacked Dhaka University, setting into motion a whole host of events, including over 10 lakh, a million refugees coming over. At that particular point of time, when India had not even come to the stage of development that we currently are, when it was very difficult to feed our own people, when you had this whole influx, and the chief ministers of West Bengal, Assam, Tripura, everybody wrote to the Prime Minister, do something about it. On the 28th of April, she called General Sam Manekshaw and said, this is the problem, I want you to do something about it. He said, if I do something about it, it will be war. She says, I don't mind if there is a war. At which point of time, he told her, you wanted to win the Bengal elections last year, you made me put a division there. Other divisions of mine are in central India. By the time I get them all together, it will be about a month. By the time I get everything to operation, this is the situation. And now I quote him. Then I tried to turn to the Prime Minister and said, Prime Minister, it's the end of April. By the time I'm ready to operate, the monsoon will have broken in that East Pakistan area. When it rains, it just does not rain, it pours. Rivers become like oceans. If you stand on one bank, you cannot see the other, and the whole countryside is flooded. My movement will be confined to the roads. The Air Force will not be able to support me, and if you wish me to enter East Pakistan, I guarantee you 100% defeat. All her ministers were shocked. He recounts how Swaran Singh, Y.B. Chavan, all asked him questions. And he stuck to his guns, at which point of time he recounts Indira Gandhi as being so angry, and he had never seen an angrier woman than that, including his own wife. At that stage, she dismissed the cabinet, said we will meet at 4 o'clock, and as everybody trooped out and General Manekshaw was the last person, she told him, Chief, will you hang on? And after she sat him down, she asked him, did you tell me the truth? He said, yes, I told you the truth. Ultimately, she told him, you know what I want, when will you be ready? He said, I cannot tell you now, Prime Minister, but let me guarantee you this. If you leave me alone, allow me to plan, make my arrangements and fix a date. I guarantee you 100% victory. Now this is a long, long story. Why have I told you this? 50 years after that incident, when somebody was bold enough to tell a prime minister, look, you've got it wrong, this is how we do it. Do you think in India today, there was a single person who could have told the current incumbent, the prime minister, no, this is not how we do it. Please look at the sequence of events. Look at the sequence of events there in 1971. March 71, there is a glorious victory at the hustings. There is a threat of war, and there is a man who tells you, you should not go into war now. Give me time. Today, last year, the first COVID case appeared in India on the 27th of March in a town called Thrissur in Kerala. It was a medical student who had come from Wuhan. At that point of time, India was greatly looking to something else on a war footing. Because on the 24th of February, our great friend President Donald J. Trump was to come to India. And we were to say, Kem cho, aujo. Everything was put on hold for that, and most importantly, the one thing that you needed to put on hold, the one place that you needed to check, your airports, we kept them open. We kept them open because obviously we needed the international press, we needed all our NRIs, everybody who was to come to the Jamboree, not to be disturbed. So we let them come in. We had Trump come, have his little tea at Sabarmati, look at the Taj Mahal, have dinner in Delhi, and he went off. Fat lot of good that we got out of it. But what we did get was the idea that India could cooperate even in the face of a pandemic. We then went into a great session of trying to send aside the pandemic by banging at utensils, all kinds of things which were totally unscientific in nature. Didn't work. And on the 24th of March, we took a decision which was, in the words of that great anchor, the very suddenness of it. On the 24th of March, we were all told, sit in your houses. Yes, those of us who were comfortable, those of us who did not live from monthly salary to monthly salary or from daily wage to daily wage, most of us sat in our houses. But what we did not envision was those of us, those who were barely one payment away from starvation. As somebody very picturesquely put it, गुनाह पासपोर्टों ने की और सजा मिली राशन कार्ड को. It was those who were at the bottom of the pyramid, who were forced out of those little hovels for which they could no longer afford the rent, who decided that there is no other go except to march forth, not out into the world with confidence, but to march back into a place where they were assured that they would at least have the family look after them. The decisions that the government took, for their very suddenness, for their very lack of thought as to the consequences have consequences even today. And even today the thinking is still the same. We are now among the world's largest producers of vaccines. If we are to balance life and livelihood, why is it that our vaccines in producing factories are not working at full capacity? That is a question that the Delhi High Court has asked the government. If we had ramped up our vaccine production and ramped up delivery, that itself would have provided employment to so many. But no, we have to have our vaccines delivered in a regulated form. No, doesn't matter even if it at current rate will take us about 3 years to vaccinate everyone. We have actually made the wrong choice. We have thought it to be a false binary that by sacrificing livelihood, we can save lives. Lives and livelihood have to go together. As Benjamin Franklin once said, that those who trade their liberties for a little security will neither have liberty nor security. The virus may soon go, but these questions, ladies and gentlemen, will continue to endure and will no doubt agitate the politics of this country. You are tomorrow going to welcome the Prime Minister here. Please ask him, where are the vaccines? You promised them in Bihar. Are you at least bringing them to Bengal? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hegde, and I think he's very much set into motion the argument that the proposition will bring to you today. Without much ado, I have great pleasure in introducing and bringing to you the first speaker speaking against the motion, Mr. Harsh Neotia, who is going to tell you, this is not how we do it.
Chairman, sir, my worthy opponents, co-panelists, citizens of Kolkata, and most importantly, distinguished members of the Calcutta Club. Before, as you all know, we are in the midst of a silly season. We have the hustings around the corner, and I'm sure this debate is going to get into a political slugfest very soon. I'm no politician. I will therefore try to share some thoughts on the topic, which, as you know, is about whether we have been able to manage lives and livelihoods. I speak against the motion because we must understand the context in which we talk about lives and livelihoods. I begin with a quote from Dr. Tedros Adhanom, Director General of WHO, and he said, quote, "It is not a choice between lives or livelihood. The quickest way to open up the economies is to defeat the virus." So today, when we talk here, it is not life versus livelihood, but us versus the virus. Today, as we see all of you seated here, I think it is testimony to the fact that we have come a considerable distance, that we are still able to meet in person after what I would call a very, very difficult year, and we are able to hold this very important debate in the annual calendar of Kolkata in the lawns of the Calcutta Club. Let me pick up 3 words from the proposition: India, failure, and balance. Now look at the context of India. When we talk about India, we talk about Team India, which is the government of India and the response and actions taken by all the states and union territories. As we all know, the pandemic is once in a 100-year kind of event, which is most unfortunate, and nobody really is prepared for something that will come so suddenly creeping on us and not just India, but the whole world is not prepared. It is without a doubt that such a pandemic will cause widespread devastation all around in both lives and livelihoods. And as we just learned, nearly 140,000 odd people, we have lost their lives and many others have been infected. The question is, how has India performed in respect to managing lives and livelihoods with respect to other nations? Now let's look at the other word, balance. Balance as a verb means to put something in such a way that it remains stable. I feel that both India and Bengal, since we are here in Kolkata, have not just been able to keep the balance and not fallen off, but I think are poised for very fast recovery, both in terms of the disease as well as in terms of the livelihoods. The health crisis that we know hit us, we had very little information. We didn't know what exactly it was. I think there was no way to, with our kind of preparation, our kind of healthcare infrastructure, with perhaps one of the lowest per million population beds anywhere for a large country, I don't think we could have taken the chance of allowing the disease to just grow rampantly. We needed the time to create the infrastructure. We needed the time to understand the protocol of treatment. And I think what the lockdown did, of course, while impacting livelihoods, was to actually give us the opportunity to build this infrastructure, which ultimately led to a much lower loss of life in comparison to many other much developed nations which had far more infrastructure and facility than we did. The final word, failure. A failure, we have to talk about it in a relative sense. Did we fail? And how do you measure whether we failed? Now, if you take it absolutely, did we lose lives? Did we lose livelihoods? Of course we did, but so did everyone in the world. What happens when there is an unusual event that comes and hits us? You try to see how to minimize it. If anyone here is trying to say that nothing, no loss could have happened, then perhaps there is no country in the world which has been able to demonstrate this. Now, when we look at the large countries in the world, let me just give you some figures. First of all, if you take COVID cases per million, India is 0.1, US is 0.08, Brazil is 0.05, UK is 0.06, and West Bengal is lower than India average, which is 0.006. So whether it is Team India, which includes Team Bengal, we have all performed remarkably well. In fact, Bengal has helped pull the averages of India up by actually keeping the COVID cases relatively down. Let's take COVID deaths. The India figure is 0.0001 per million. The US is 0.0015. Brazil is 0.0011. UK is 0.0018. And West Bengal is also a little lower than the India average, again helping India. The reason I'm mentioning Bengal and India is because in this binary of politics, we want to attribute blame from one to another. But I feel that this has been one of those unfortunate events that has hit everyone, and every state with their own capacity has tried to do something to alienate both lives and livelihoods. And India has done, I would think, reasonably well compared to what we see around the world, and Bengal has helped to improve India's averages by doing even better than most other states. Let's take the GDP. For the next year, the IMF projects that India will grow at 11.5, the US will grow at 5.1, UK at 4.5, Euro at 4.2. Now, obviously we've had a terrible, the first quarter. We also had a significant recession of almost 8% in the second quarter. But in the third quarter, we are seeing some green shoots with a marginal recovery above the 0 point, and we hope that we will have a better fourth quarter. But the clear point that I see, and I must mention here that as a businessman and as someone who has been involved, directly impacted by this pandemic, I am in real estate business, in hospitality business, and these have been in the front of taking the brunt of the pandemic. In fact, you see the salt and pepper beard, it's also it's outgrowth of the terrible stress that I went through. A friend of mine on a lighter note quipped that Harsh, you've lost weight. I said, yes, it has gone directly proportional to the loss in wealth and income. But having faced the brunt of this, I see that in the last few months, we are seeing a sharp recovery. People are coming back to the restaurants, people are coming back to buy properties, the construction is now almost at full swing, things are opening up, resort properties are doing well, city properties are not doing so well because we still have air connectivity internationally down and large gatherings are not permitted. But it is very, very evident that there is a steep rise. My personal view, therefore, is that we have been, as a country, both able to manage relatively better than the rest of the world. We have to look at the operative word, balance. We have to look at the word, how India has performed with respect to the rest of the countries. Then only we will be able to answer this question. If it is an absolute discussion, what is the debate? Of course we have lost lives and of course we have lost livelihoods. But the question is, what happens how do you respond in the event of such a pandemic? I think the Bengal as a state has done remarkably well in both seeing to it that succor and help reach the people on time. I think as a country we have responded with the given knowledge, with the given situation reasonably well. And together, I think as we see statistically, we have fared better than most other countries, and therefore I certainly speak against the motion. I think we have been able to reasonably balance lives and livelihoods. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harsh. COVID taught us many things. It taught us how to do more with less. It taught us how to hope with less promises. It taught us how to renew our ties with our family and with nature. How to accept, above all, the inevitability of our inferiority as a species. But it did something more. It did something that no preacher or evangelist, no religious Mahatma or political giant had been able to do, no messiah or martyr had achieved, no religious leader or political giant in the history of mankind had been able to do. It was able to unite the entire human race. And the union was not out of love. It was out of fear. The fear of the virus. As a species, we were united irrespective of our religious, political, or social thoughts. Calcuttans were united irrespective of whether they were Trinamool or BJP supporters. We were all worried, virus ta hobe na to. And for the first time, our species were united across the globe in a union of fear. Today, the Calcutta Club and the Telegraph seeks to break that union by this debate. And we have two interpretations of events of the last year that you have come to hear. And as we go on, and as things hot up, it gives me great pleasure to introduce and bring to the dais my professional colleague, Dr. Kunal Sarkar, to speak in favor of the motion.
When Telegraph extended his very gracious invitation for this debate, I was under the illusion that we would be indulging in free speech, till a report came out a few days ago suggesting that it won't be entirely free, as Freedom House UK tell us we are partially free. And I leave it to the offices of the chairperson and the Telegraph that I belong to the right part. Now there is something going around the air these days called sedition, which most North Indian channels interpret as sedation. And generally they don't know that unknowingly they are speaking the truth. But it is the presence of Mr. Sanjay Hegde that gives me tremendous confidence that should such a action takes place, there is Mr. Mitra in the front line, so please do take care of me if I fall over. There is one person, Mr. Chairman, sir, that my dear friend should not have mentioned in the opening line of anything to do with COVID. It is like you starting a lecture on financial ethics by mentioning Nirav Modi, and that is the name of Tedros with COVID. It is under his callousness that 2 precious months were lost, that if not for the lone warring Chinese doctor Li Wenliang, that the news of COVID would not have broken out to the world. And it is under the very eyes of a corrupt and doctored World Health Organization that 2 precious months were lost in taking effective measure of the pandemic. Sanjay has already mentioned about the airports being open. Yes, no matter how triumphantly nationalistic you are, COVID, unlike the internet, jet engine and everything else, did not originate in India. Those of you who think, perish the thought. It did not. It is not quoted in Indian mythology. It happened somewhere else and it had to be brought to our country. And in order to bring COVID to our country, it is not a pandemic that spread by physical movement. It is a pandemic that spread through flights. And as Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam, every country in physical proximity of China had shut their gates down, way down in late December, early January. Ladies and gentlemen, we waited till the 20th of March. And in the last 7 days that the flights were open, something around 20 to 25 lakh passengers came in from Europe and United States at a time when Europe and United States were running an infectivity rate of around 20%, which meant that we invited in 5 lakh infections only in the last week through the main airports of Mumbai, Delhi, and look, in Bengal we are far-sighted. So 20 years ago, our forefathers took precautions that we have no international flights. We were all ready for the pandemic. Apart from the few cheap tours to Bangkok or what have you, we had stopped. We were all ready for the fight. But yet, migrant labors and all this introduced the infection to us. And look, even the poor Bengali was not spared. So that is the callousness that brought the infection into our country. And having done that, when Milan was burning, Paris was burning, London was fumbling, in about 24th of March, we decided to go in the lockdown. And when we entered the lockdown, ladies and gentlemen, we had a case count of around 600. About 10 to 11 people had died in India, and we went into the lockdown with the manifest interest that we have to flatten the curve. We are not talking about Hollywood beautiful babes over here. So we wanted to flatten the curve, and 68 days later, When we emerged from the lockdown, we had 2.5 lakh cases and 7,500 dead. And that is how the curve had expanded. It was looking alluring, but it was a wrong kind of curve that you don't want to look at, ladies and gentlemen. That is where the 68 days lockdown left this country with. The question is why? The question is simply because of the reason, first of all, somebody was under the impression, I don't know who it is, don't quote me for it, somebody was under the impression that this was a general election happening. So we had the entire 3 million square kilometers of India locked down monolithically at once. That is not possible. India is not going to behave as a homogeneous, contiguous entity because the coronavirus may not require a passport or a CAA or an NRC, but it requires time to travel. And this coronavirus came in through the west first, went to the north next, then to the south, and then very reluctantly through the east. So we had no idea what the chronology or the time frame spread of the virus is going to be. We had no granular data from the ground. We had impulsion, we had impulse, we had perceptions, we had bang utensils, 4 hours notice, come on, lockdown, chalega. That is the kind of spirit and knowledge in which the lockdown was maintained. And how did we go to implement this lockdown? The police, everybody worked brilliantly. But it was a law and order exercise. You had the bamboos, you had the thing, you had people being locked in the rooms, you were really, the only thing did not happen is that the corona-infected people were not deemed to be under trials. So apart from that, we had a stringent lockdown. But what was missing? When we contained people, we did not test them adequately. When we contained people, we very early in the game, we lost our enthusiasm for contact tracing. So what happened is, after all this barricading, restriction, containment was around, fair enough, we satisfied our physicality of the lockdown, but the epidemiological core of the problem was not addressed to, not in the least, ladies and gentlemen. And why did it happen? Harsh spoke about Team India. Yes, it was Team India, but it was like the football team representing India in cricket. Why was it? Answer me one question this evening. I have very little money. I can ask Harsh to give you a free flat. Who is India's chief epidemiologist? Answer me one question. Every civilized nation on the earth knows who is leading their epidemiology program. There is an entity, friends, in India called the Center for Disease Control, located in Pune. Perhaps the central government thought it was hostile territory, it's in Maharashtra. So perish the thought. I am going to hand over pandemic control to the ICMR, which is an august body of very peace-loving, quiet gentlemen and women who are generally engaged in research. It is a research organization. So how come by bypassing, circumventing the sole entity in India which was supposed to take control of pandemic management, it is handed over to a research organization? Because not that you have the right men there, but because you have the yes men there. And 1 month into the lockdown, ladies and gentlemen, I have the slide on my phone if any of you are interested. There was a meeting of a committee which was called the Empowered Committee. The committee was tremendously empowered but very ill-informed. And the committee put up on the wall a PowerPoint slide. Those of you who are interested, I have it over here. And that PowerPoint slide said, this is the chairman of the Empowered Committee speaking on 24th of April, guaranteeing everybody that there will not be a single RNA molecule left on India by 16th of May. This is the intellectual input that went into the formulation of the lockdown that we thought by 16th of May it will be done and dusted. And why did this happen? Because this empowered committee was sequentially led by a biomedical person, then by a cardiologist, then by a pediatrician. There wasn't a single field qualified epidemiologist to be seen anywhere at a time when 15 out of the 20 leading epidemiologists of the world were Indians. Water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. This is the reason, ladies and gentlemen, that why you had a program which had all enthusiasm, which had all restriction, but if you look at the fundamentals of public health, we faltered. We were supposed to add capacity to healthcare. God Almighty, for somebody who's been starving for 73 years, how do you get marasmic Indian healthcare looking like, the abs of Salman Khan in 60 days' time? Not possible, ladies and gentlemen. And we did not lead because at the very maximum, not a single Indian state even used 50% of its capacity. We were separating hospitals. Bengal had 38,000 beds. We coped with 20,000. The rest 19,000 were never used. India had 40,000 ventilators. The maximum record of the number of people ventilated at any single time did not exceed 10,000. And everybody came in. If you had a lathe machine in your workshop, everybody was in a 9 o'clock news manufacturing ventilators. I was praying that the last person not to manufacture ventilators should be the mobile phone companies, because if you had a ventilator drop out for a few seconds, the results will be rather severe, ladies and gentlemen. So thankfully, the mobile phone operators did not get into the queue for manufacturing ventilators, everybody else did. I break another myth in front of you. I should not be sharing these secrets, saying that India is a young population, that's why we've done so well. Of course we are a young population. The birth rate of India has plateaued a decade earlier. So after your birth rate plateaus, if you continue to be a young population, it means you are a bad healthcare. It means you do not know how to keep the 60 plus alive. That is why you are a young population. So there are people going out painting the town red, saying that we are a young population, that's why we've had low mortality. We may have had relatively less mortality, but do take count of the fact that 65% of India's mortality is under 50 years of age. We have not lost octogenarians. We have lost, friends, people in the prime of their lives. What was COVID, friends? Was it an intrusion of a greedy humanity into the environment? What was COVID, friends? Was it the cynical behavior of some country with a crazy scientist? We do not know. But it has taken 102 years for the next respiratory pandemic to appear. I'm sure the next one may not take another 102 years. But whenever it comes, ladies and gentlemen, remember the countries of Southeast Asia, 5 countries added together do not have a mortality of 200. The countries which are nearest to China have had the best possible outcomes of COVID in terms of cases, disease, mortality, and economic preservation. So India had a lesson to learn. And if not for this time, in the words of my friend, Mr. Sanjay Hegde, when he says, for those people who are one meal away from the starvation, you need to absorb the lessons. You need to listen to the right men and not the yes men. There may be contrarian opinion. You have to have the courage of conviction to stand up to it. Yes, we did it. The question you should ask yourself this evening is that did you emerge from the pandemic because of the policies or in spite of the policies? The question you should feel pride or proud about is 1.5 crore of Kolkata, majority stayed indoors during Durga Puja. What US could not do during Thanksgiving, that Europe could not do during Christmas, Calcuttans did during Durga Puja. Feel proud of it, because you have done it. Each one of you have done it. Otherwise there would be beds lined up across 5 kilometers either side of the pavement. We owe it to the people of Dharavi, ladies and gentlemen. When the government had run away, the self-help groups of Dharavi came together. And when the country had given up on Dharavi, the people of Belgachia, the people of the slums of Delhi, the slums of Mumbai, they got together. So the government fumbled, but the people triumphed.
Kunal, you need to wind up.
I will, Sandeep, but let the lessons not wind up, because COVID has come to us with very sharp pointers. And if India has to be empowered and Atmanirbhar, then we have to have the Atma Vishwas to face up to facts as they stand and not to facts as we want it. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Kunal. And I can't but as a medical personnel help feeling the same sort of helplessness that Dr. Sarkar talked about. Debating compulsions made him tell you how the central government had a committee that lacked epidemiologists. The truth is, the state government had a committee, and the two people missing from the committee were virologists and public health experts, given that we have a school of tropical medicine here in Calcutta, which has the world's best virologists. None of them were there in that committee either. The truth of the matter is that all over the world, society and science succumbed to the political eccentricities of our elected masters. Across continents, decisions on public health were taken on basis of principles which, if stated by a second-year medical student, would have made him fail his exam. Yet that's what happened. And as Kunal pointed out, governments all over the world ignored the advice of scientists and public health experts, and political survival took precedence over biological survival of the species. And the medical profession tore its hairs as more colleagues died in this deadly combat. But the administrative generals disregarded the voices of the infantry on the ground. In fact, it may be a piece of statistics, and I feel fearful to say it in the presence of politicians, but the number of politicians we lost worldwide in the pandemic was less than 10,000 of the number of health workers we lost. And in case you wonder why in the Calcutta Club, in a panel of 7, we have 2 medical people on the dais, I will let you know that in the year 2020, 64 uniformed Indians lost their lives on our borders. 734 doctors lost their lives due to COVID. 25 were below 35 years of age. And on that somber note, I invite the next speaker speaking against the motion, Mr. Prosenjit Basu, to give you his deliberations.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. I stand here to oppose the motion. And let me just start with something Dr. Kunal Sarkar just said about East Asia, where I've lived for 26 years. East Asia didn't just have this recent pandemic. East Asia has had several, and they all originated from the same country, China. There was, the better known one was in 2003. It was called SARS. and about 6,000 people died in East Asia. So the East Asians have a lot of experience. There's also been several bird flu epidemics that have hit East Asia over the past several years. Or over the last 20 years, there have been at least 3 episodes of bird flu that killed many thousands. So the East Asians, Taiwan in particular, the neighbor of China, has done remarkably well during this pandemic, because Taiwan has terrific experience of dealing with this in the past. But I will start with another group of people that are a great favorite of Dr. Sarkar's, epidemiologists. On the 20th of March, 2020, almost exactly, slightly less than a year ago, a rather well-known epidemiologist who had worked in Barack Obama's White House, called Ramanan Lakshminarayanan, claimed that India was likely to see 300 million people contract COVID-19, with the best case scenario being 200 million people. He claimed on the 20th of March, 2020, that 2 to 2.5 million Indians were likely to die, given that 10% of all Indian adults are diabetic, 1/3 are hypertensive, and there is a high incidence of pneumonia and tuberculosis in India's population. A week later, he wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times on the 27th of March, 2020. This famous epidemiologist predicted in that article that 300 to 500 million Indians would be afflicted with COVID-19 by July 2020. In retrospect, these weren't entirely sensational predictions. A century ago, during the flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920, 14 million Indians died of that coronavirus pandemic, or about 5% of British India's population in 1920. There were fewer people in British India in 1921 than in 1911. The only time in the last 200 years in which India's population actually declined between one census and the next. But what actually happened during the COVID pandemic of 2020 in India? Compared with the predictions of 300 to 500 million getting ill with COVID, India has so far reported less than 11.2 million cases. 11.2 million against a prediction of 300 to 500 million. And compared with predictions of 2 to 2.5 million deaths from COVID, less than 158,000 have died from COVID in India. Every death is tragic and every death is lamentable. But the proportion of people dying is so much lower than what the epidemiologists predicted or what happened a century ago. While 5% of India's population died from the coronavirus of 1919, just 0.1% of India's population has died from the coronavirus of 2020. India now accounts for 17.7% of the world's population, but accounted for only 6% of global deaths from this current coronavirus. In 1920, 100 years ago, India accounted for 13% of world population, but 28% of world deaths from that coronavirus occurred in India. So, relative to India's share of world population, India has done remarkably well in terms of lives lost due to the coronavirus of 2020. But, in order to preserve lives, India temporarily imposed one of the world's strictest lockdowns. And by the way, there were, of course, flights coming in, but contact tracing began in India as early as the first week of January 2020. I will show you that India's response has actually helped strengthen the resilience of the economy and has positioned India's people superbly to take advantage of the opportunities of the present and the future. In the old Nehruvian India, so beloved of our antediluvian, old-fashioned socialists and Marxists, including perhaps some on the other side of the aisle here today, the preferred response would have been a blaze of announced doles and other government spending. But as Rajiv Gandhi revealed, perhaps in a moment of weakness, 35 years ago, 17%, just 17% of all this announced spending would have reached its intended beneficiaries. The other 83% would have disappeared down the rabbit holes that are called politicians' pockets. So your money, paid by taxpayers like you, would simply have been stolen by politicians in the old Nehruvian India. In the new India that Prime Minister Modi is building, every household has access to a bank account, a usable toilet at home or in school, and a working cooking gas connection. These seem basics. But remember, shockingly, just 7 years ago, 67 years after independence, half of all rural households had no cooking gas, toilets, or bank accounts. Those bank accounts are the most useful because they allow direct benefit transfer to intended beneficiaries. This eliminates the cut money that socialist politicians were so used to pocketing. When some 20 million internal migrants returned to their rural homes fearing the contagion from the Wuhan coronavirus, Modi's New India provided them several options. Either take on an emergency Manrega job to help create some capital assets in your village, or borrow a Mudra microloan to help create and start a new enterprise. Or, after an appropriate period of lockdown and rest, take up a new industrial job, taking advantage of the new labor codes that are resulting in a rebound in both domestic and foreign direct investment in this country. If you looked at the last GDP figures released a few days ago, fixed investment spending in India grew 2.5% in the last quarter, year on year. And FDI, foreign direct investment into India, grew 13% last year at a time when world FDI flows actually declined more than 20%. So already the new labor codes are creating a buzz about India and bringing massive amounts of new investment in. Even the anti-government, anti-Modi Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy figures show that the unemployment rate across India today is already at a 2-year low. So the unemployment rate too has been fixed. In the old Nehruvian India, any adverse development in the global economy resulted in a balance of payments crisis in India. So Nehru was frequently obliged to turn to the IMF with a begging bowl. Beginning in 1957-58, his daughter Indira turned to the IMF in 1966, devalued the rupee, and we had 2 years of economic stagnation. In 1980, India again turned to the IMF for the largest ever loan that the IMF had given, $5 billion. And then, of course, in 91 as well, there was an additional loan of $2.2 billion, which helped to grease the wheels that allowed the most dramatic and most positive economic reform undertaken by Narasimha Rao to break the shackles of that old Nehruvian economy. In the new India that Prime Minister Modi is building, livelihoods are preserved for the present and enhanced for the future. Growth-enhancing economic reforms are adopted without being forced to do so by the IMF. After all, for the first time since fiscal year 2003-04, when Vajpayee was Prime Minister, India in 2020 had a current account surplus During the last 12 months, India's foreign reserves have increased by 22% to $585 billion. And the IMF has had to admit that India will be the world's fastest growing economy this year in 2021. They are predicting 11.5%. I think they'll be wrong. It should be more like 13 to 14% growth in the year ahead. In the new India that Prime Minister Modi is building, the government is fiscally prudent. That is why you have a balance of payment surplus, a current account surplus. This means that the government only spends money after it is sure that revenues exist and the government spending will not unduly burden our children, who are the nation's future taxpayers. Those future taxpayers are burdened if the government borrows too much now with the promise to repay at some distant time in the future. So not so long ago, just 2011 and 2013, you might remember that India's rupee was considered among the fragile 5 currencies that would come under pressure every time something happened in the global economy. Now, in the past year, while the rest of the world has struggled, India's rupee has stayed stable and strong. So I would submit that this House is wrong. During the pandemic, India, in fact, massively outperformed the world and its own history from a century ago in preserving lives. And India did far better than most of the world, and especially our own Nehruvian history, in preserving current livelihoods and creating the framework to hugely enhance future livelihoods. Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.
Thank you, Mr. Basu. I have to say, after my rather somber deliberations before his talk, his cheerful talk, if nothing else, makes me feel a lot richer than I came to this club feeling this evening. I did not learn much about bank accounts or gases or toilets during the pandemic, but I tell you what I learned in this pandemic. I learned how to cut the grass in the garden. I learned how to cook a meal. For the first time, my Labrador and I were allowed into the family kitchen. I learned how long it takes for a bud from the mango tree to blossom into a fruit. And I learned which is the star you can see on a non-polluted evening in Calcutta when you gaze towards the west. But above all, I learned what the expression going viral really means. Mr. Basu informed us of how the immigrants from Wuhan had the red carpet laid for them to return to the country in. I think our next speaker, Moha Moitro, might have something to say about the carpet that was taken away from the feet of immigrants from Bengal, Kerala, and Bihar working in different parts of the country. Moha Moitro.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always difficult, I think, being in public life in one of these platforms, because no matter who, each one seems to hate a different person, but always, almost always, everyone loves to hate a politician. So I think we always come in kind of, having to play extra defensive. But I hope that today I will actually steer clear of the politics of it and try and stick to what the real issue at hand is. I mean, we can start with whether Nehru or actually Babur or the marauding Mughals were to blame for COVID being brought into India. I could start with that, but I don't think it would take us anywhere. I think what this pandemic has shown all of us, especially those of us in public life, people like me, people like Dr. Sarkar, people like the Honorable Moderator, is that there is such a wide gap in our understanding of India and especially crisis in India, of how we react to crisis and how we are equipped to deal with crisis. The idea of a crisis for a rich man in India or a rich person or a poor person are two very different things. The idea of how we cope with the crisis is very different from a rich person and that for a poor person. But as far as any government is concerned, the primary duty of any elected government is to make sure that a crisis is mitigated almost equally for a rich person as for a poor person. It is not in the perspective of personal choice. The minute you're elected into government, you lose the personal perspective. No decision of yours has the, I would say, luxury of being applicable only to the rich or only to the poor. And the truth of this was, nowhere was it as stark as during this pandemic. We are talking about balancing lives and livelihoods, and that the government did the balance lives and livelihoods. But the truth is that this isn't really a fair trade-off, because for the rich, you may have the choice to stay at home and work at home. You have a choice to decide whether you put your life at risk by leaving the house, or whether you decide to cut down on the number of hours you work and work from home. For a poor person, life is livelihood, sirs, ladies and gentlemen. Life is livelihood. There is no police in the world that can stop a person from leaving their home if they have no food in their home, no money in their pocket, and nowhere to get essentials. There is no police in the world that could stop people from doing it. And there is no government that can stop it. So I think this trade-off between lives and livelihoods is almost a false binary, as Mr. Hegde put it. There is no choice for about, I would say, 75% of India. 94% of the workforce in India is in the informal sector. Contrary to what my esteemed friend on the other side pointed out, he said that we've done well. And people, they had the choice. When the migrants came back home, they had the choice of whether you chose to work in Manrega or to work in a large industry. People do not have that choice in India. 94% of India is in the informal sector. And opposed to China, where almost 56% of the Chinese working population are engaged in large factories employing 200 people or more, in India that figure is close to 5%. That's how large the disparity is. So the issue is, when you're faced with a crisis like the corona pandemic, what does any government do? I'm not debating whether the government should have gone into lockdown or not gone into lockdown. Perhaps that is a choice that was inevitable for any government globally. And lockdown, on the face of it, was the right thing to do. But a government which has the ability to mobilize lakhs of troops overnight surely had the ability to give clarity to the movement of migrant workers, 30 to 50 million people who were stuck in different cities. And that's where I think this government failed. Now, we aren't here, no government is here to be rewarded on what we did right. That is what is needed to be done. That is the duty of every government. We cannot be applauded. No central government or state government can be applauded on "I saved so many lives." That's what you're supposed to do. No one's going to give you a first prize for doing that. Let's get over these kind of ridiculous comparisons of, had we not done this, this would have happened. Had India not locked down, then the death would have been more. The truth is, we don't know. The question is, 30% of India's workforce are made up of migrant workers. What the government did, in the manner in which they did it, was completely blind and callous to the plight of these workers. And I think that's where we failed completely to balance lives and livelihoods. When we're talking about, we had Mr. Basu on the other side talk about direct benefit transfers. Shall I give you one statistic? The direct benefit transfers that were handed out by this government till date are to the tune of 113,000 crores. This government took back from the same people exactly 113,000 crores by way of extra cess on gas and petrol. That's the end. We talk of how well India did. India was the single worst performing developing economy in 2020. Single worst performing economy. We spent 2% on social transfers compared to 20% by OECD countries and 6% in middle income countries. So there's a false trade-off again. Now, whose lives did you save? Whose lives did you actually save? When you talk of the number of deaths that we had deaths due to the disease, which were probably evenly split between the rich and the poor. I don't have the statistics on that. But we talk of the collateral damage, as President Bush so sort of clearly put it. When we talk of collateral damage, we had over 800 migrant deaths due to road accidents. How many people like you and me died due to road accidents because we happened to be walking on the road during the pandemic and a truck mowed us down? How many? Was it one? Was it two? So when you see that, when you think of 80 people dying on Shramik special deaths, suffocated, dehydrated, yes, the number is 80, it's not very much. But compare that to 0 for people like you and me. Did the government do a good job? 350 people died in other accidents relating to the railways during this time. This is data put out with the Indian Railways. How many people like you and me died? Did the government do a good job? So the point is not whether we balance lives and livelihoods. For the poor, lives are livelihoods. And when we planned the lockdown, when you announced the lockdown in the way that you did on the 24th of March, I think on the 24th of March, the number of people who were infected were about 360. The number of deaths was about 7. On the 8th of August 2020, 2.15 million people were infected. We were the 3rd highest infection rate after UK and Brazil. And we had about 44,000 deaths, which was the 5th highest. So you can go into whether the government prevented X or Y. The truth is, we don't know. When Mr. Basu pointed out, the epidemiologist at Mr. Barack Obama's office, the President Obama's office, who said that 300 to 500 million people would be infected, he wasn't far from the truth. As of today, 11.2 million people have tested positive. All the surveys in Delhi, in Maharashtra, and all the COVID surveys show that the ratio of people who have gone undetected to the people who have tested positive is 50 to 1. So when you have 11.2 million people who have tested positive in RT-PCR tests and you multiply that number by 50, then 300 to 500 million people being infected is not very far off. It's not very far off. When we talk of the number of deaths, and we are saying we've only had 157,000 deaths, 1.57 million deaths, 1.57 lakh deaths. The issue is, again, when you look at the population of India, this is a disease that adversely affects an above 65 population. In India, as of the latest statistics available end of 2019, only 6.3% of the Indian population is above the age of 65. Only 6.3% of the Indian population, compared to about 21% of Europe, which is above the age of 65. So obviously, when you have a younger population, also due to the fact that we have poorer healthcare than anywhere else, then as Dr. Sarkar put it, then one of the, I would say, better fallouts out of that is that we have a lower mortality rate. That is not something that the government needs to be slapped on the back for. That has nothing to do with the government as such. It's just a result of worse healthcare and what our population, what our demographics look like. One of the other things that I would like to bring up is that when we're looking at this pandemic, there's the numbers, there's the statistics, but speaking as someone who's worked on the ground all throughout the pandemic in the constituency, and having to deal with 2 to 3 lakh people who came back to my district alone, getting off the trains, looking out for them, I think the one thing that will stay with us is, as a nation, we have dehumanized our people. More than anything else, whether this government has failed, or whether this government has failed to, whether it's improved the economy, whether the economy is K-shaped or V-shaped, or whether, economic recovery is going to be 11% or 10%, I think what this pandemic has done has brought shame, the feeling of shame and humiliation in all of us, which will stay with us for a long time. This generation, people like us, didn't see partition. We didn't even see the Bangladesh war. We didn't see that absolute, abject desperation in people's eyes. I've never seen that till the pandemic. And I think the sight of people working, thousands of people walking for hundreds of miles, just trying to reach home, with no social welfare, with absolutely no social safety net, 70 years after independence. Many years, 50 years after the Bangladesh war, 70 years after independence, is, I think, what has dehumanized us as a nation. And I think that is where the government has failed, both in terms of balancing lives and livelihoods, and frankly, it has failed India in its primary task, which is basically to provide the same level of human dignity to every single Indian. That is the task of every government, and I think that is what the government this time during the pandemic failed to do. It failed to provide the same standard of human dignity. The poor were completely disproportionately affected, whereas the rich and the middle classes were kept aside. And I think that's what we need to take away from this, that not only did they failed spectacularly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, in this battle of humans versus virus, why this virus has emerged victorious so many times? It is strange, but as a man of biology, I cannot help but point it out to you, that as human beings have evolved in evolution, we have become more complex and more complicated. As the virus has evolved, it has become more and more simple. So much so that it cannot even replicate until it gets the help of another living being. And it is the simplicity of the virus that has won over the complexities of the human being. A thought worth thinking about as we invite the last speaker of the day, Mr. Tathagata Rai, one of your own club members, to give his deliberations.
Mr. President, sir, ladies and gentlemen, it's a matter of great honor to be invited to a debate which is being staged in a place which I call my second home. However, I have been at a loss to understand the motion of the debate. In the opinion of the House, during pandemic, India failed to balance lives with livelihood. Saving lives is a matter of medicine, maybe surgery. Saving livelihoods is a matter of economics. The two don't have much to do with each other, but we have tried to connect the two in this motion, which to me makes little sense. But I was reassured by the fact that I have to speak against the motion. We have just come through an apocalyptic year of 2020, and on this stage, the debate was opened by Sanjay, who said that one death is a tragedy, several or a million deaths is a mere statistic, a saying which is attributable to Joseph Stalin. I am tempted to quote a person whom I consider infinitely superior to Joseph Stalin. His name is Albert Einstein, and he said, "You can't use an old map to explore a new world." What we are being asked by the proposition is to plan for a bolt from the blue. We all know what a bolt from the blue is. Can anyone plan his life in such a way that he can't get a bolt from the blue? Obviously one can't. But that is the sort of thing that we are being asked by the proposition to do. There is no doubt that people had lost their lives. People had also suffered in terms of livelihood, hospitality and transport industries, apart from real estate business, which Harsh mentioned, they had taken the beating. But the loss of lives and the loss of livelihood have nothing to do with each other. The loss of life or the possibility of the loss of life gave rise to a panic, particularly in an uncertain world, in an uncertain situation, which prompted a lot of industries to lay off their people, and that led to the loss of livelihood. Now, how can these two things be balanced? They are absolutely two different kettles of fish, like apples and oranges. You can't compare them. So what we are against is an absurd proposition.
Thereafter, I would say that we were plunged into a sea of uncertainty, which can compare with the state of Columbus when he was navigating across the unknown Atlantic. Was it possible for Columbus, or was it possible for anyone in this country or any other country to plan or to devise methods of doing things in a most beneficial manner, in a most optimal manner? I think not. Abraham Lincoln had famously said that the good thing about the future is that it comes one day at a time. So we had to do it one day at a time. But in spite of that, in spite of all these uncertainties, we tried to put certainty into uncertainty, and we tried to create a regime in which people could be persuaded to behave in a particular way, and which will prevent the spread or the deaths due to corona. And that is precisely what we did. In the process, we were, as I have said, we were plunged into uncertainties. We were plunged into great confusion also. In the beginning, you would have remembered, those of you who are in social media, when corona came out, people used to joke about it. Oh, it's very common in Bengali because we say to our children, eta corona, ota corona. So we are not afraid of corona. But that smile evaporated as soon as the rate of infection started multiplying exponentially, and thereafter became a serious scourge which required the government to impose the lockdown. Now, when the lockdown was imposed, I'd like to remind you that it was imposed for 3 weeks. Eventually, it was extended for many more months. Why was it imposed for 6 weeks, 3 weeks? Because we didn't know where we are going. But certain people had certainties, so they said, first, the eta corona, ota corona, I have already mentioned. The second thing they said, this is no pandemic. This is, Donald Trump said it in USA and someone said it in Kolkata. This is merely a subterfuge to draw people's attention from the communal riots in Delhi. Then things started getting worse and worse, and the narrative gradually changed. Then the news magazine Outlook India on the 12th of May quoted a very important person here to say that we will be sending 9 trains to other states to bring back our expatriate citizens. Citizens who had found no employment in West Bengal and had been forced to go to other states. Now, you would remember, ladies and gentlemen, that when we were children, at least people of my age were children, it was the opposite case. People used to come from other states to work in West Bengal and send the money that they earned out of West Bengal. The amount of money that was going out by way of money orders from Kolkata was a huge thing. Now the thing has reversed completely, and therefore there was this pronouncement of sending 9 trains. Then when the trains started coming, 9 trains could be sent only by the Indian Railways, not by any state government. Then when the train started coming, there was an announcement that, oh, this is Corona Express. Corona Express is coming here. And that put us, got us all into a state of consternation. What is this person talking about, Corona Express? And then there was a modification to that which said that, no, I didn't coin the term. It is the voice of the people. They are saying that this is Corona Express. So we were plunged into more confusion, not knowing whether we should welcome these people or we should let them not come. We should prevent them from coming. We didn't know. This was the state of confusion that was prevailing in the country, in particular in the state. There was an announcement on the 5th of May, as is reported in a web magazine called The Print, which said that the center was being blamed, the central government was being blamed for a delay in imposing the lockdown and not shutting down airports early. That is a thing that Kunal has mentioned, and quite rightly. But thereafter, Outlook India on the 12th of May 2020 reported that the center could have given 2-3 days to the laborers to come back. Now, which is true? The point is, the point of pointing out all these newspaper reports from the last one apocalyptic year is to illustrate the state of confusion, the state of uncertainty that was prevailing in this country. And we had to wade our way through it. We had to wade our way through the uncharted ocean that Columbus was navigating. Did we do a bad job? I submit that we didn't. We did the best possible thing under the circumstances. What else could we have done? India was quietly trying to find a way out of this thing by several methods. One was imposing lockdowns. Second was creating seriousness in the minds of the people. This knocking of utensils has brought forth a lot of ridicule. Knocking of utensils will not drive away corona, nor was it ever said by anyone that it will drive away corona. But it was required to create the consciousness in people that we have got to behave in a certain way in these circumstances. Then research on vaccine went on simultaneously, and finally we had to get the country to wade its way through these uncertainties. What was the ultimate result? Unemployment, which was 7.2% in 2020, February, had risen to 23.5% in July-August 2020. How much was it in last February? Last month, according to the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, it was 6.9%. Worse, it was better than what it was in February 2020. Did we do badly? Did we fail to balance life and livelihood? I think not. Some of the other things that have been said by the proposition require some reference.
Mr. Roy, you need to wind up. You have just barely had 11 minutes, sir.
All right. I will wind up pretty soon. Airports, keeping the airports open has been criticized. Would it have prevented corona? Other countries have tried to do it. The example of East Asia was given, but it has been effectively rubbished by Prosenjit here, who said that East Asia had had a much better experience in these matters. And therefore, it was not, the cases of East Asia and the East Asian countries and India were not comparable. We have enormously bigger country and an enormously bigger population. All these problems added to our, but as I said, we have gone through the process and we have come out victorious. It is not to say that the war against corona has been finally won, but this is to say that corona, we are on the point of winning, we are on the winning side, and very soon it will be a thing of the past, it will be a nightmare that we live through, which will give us important lessons of how to live through these. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of the formal part of the debate. I have to say, before I request the two leaders to sum up, that I have a little quarrel to pick with two of the speakers. One is Dr. Kunal Sarkar and the other is Mr. Tathagata Roy. And the reason is both of them referred to COVID saying what was COVID. That's what Kunal said, and Mr. Roy just told you we have overcome COVID. And I fear the number of masks that I see in the Calcutta Club members going down has increased. And perhaps I don't really want to be blamed for a sudden spurt in our figures in the city 5 days after this event. You know, what is really this debate has been about is about post-mortems. And I have to say this with due apologies to my wife, who happens to be a professor of pathology and is in the audience, that it is said in medical parlance that the best physician is worse than the best pathologist. The reason being that the best physician still makes mistakes. The worst pathologist, even if he or she makes mistakes, can only be greeted by blessings from heaven. Whereas the best physician, even if he makes a mistake, is dragged to court and commissions. The worst pathologist has no fear of that because his client is in a jar of formalin. And what we have heard today are pathologists debating post-mortem on a motion, saying, did we do the right thing or did we do the wrong thing? When we still don't know whether we are doing the right thing or are we doing the wrong thing, even by having a national debate. Physically here in these lawns, are we doing the right thing? Time will tell. And it is time now to hear the summing up speeches from the leaders of the two sides. And debating tradition bestows upon me the responsibility of asking first the leader of the opposition to give his comments. And for this, the leaders will have 5 minutes each.
Mr. Moderator, sir, unfortunately, I had made notes of what the proposition was saying, because there was much more to say against it. And what the opposition was saying was so obvious that I didn't make too many notes. But let me come to the submissions that we have made on this side of the aisle. I remember that Harsh began his talk with the experience that he had had as a businessman in the city of Calcutta, in the field of real estate and hospitality. And he has explained how, in spite of all these difficulties, all the uncertainties that we have spoken about, how these things were tackled. And the ultimate result was not all that unnerving. As opposed to that, we have heard Mohua being in a state of shame. She concluded her speech by saying that she is in a state of great shame. I commiserate with her, and we shall try on this side to get her out of it, try our best to get her out of it. But the speakers who have spoken from this side of the aisle have, I think, convincingly demonstrated that there is no reason for her to be ashamed, except, of course, political reasons. That's a different matter. Prosenjit, on this side, has explained at great length how the figures of the corona-affected people, their rate of recovery, the daily rate of infection have compared with those of other countries, notably East Asian countries, to which Kunal has made a reference. And in the process, Prosenjit has rubbished entirely Kunal's assertion that the East Asian countries in this process were much more alert, much more careful, much more observant to prevent the spread of corona. I have mentioned myself that this performance of the East Asian countries cannot be compared to those of India because of the difference in area, difference of population, the heterogeneity of the population, and so many other things. Prosenjit has very aptly and very completely demonstrated how we have passed on from Nehruvian India to present day India. How in the times of Nehruvian India we had to traipse the world with a begging bowl in hand while the Prime Minister was busy with managing the problems of some far-off country, with less time to bother about what was happening within our country. But the economy was going from bad to worse, and we had been plunged into a state of corruption which was justified during the emergency by saying that corruption is a worldwide phenomenon. By that token, one can very well say that COVID was a worldwide phenomenon, so we are not to blame for it. But we did our best to combat it. Ladies and gentlemen, that is more or less the substance of what we said from the opposition side, and I rest my case, the case of the opposition, for your kind consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The final speaker, the leader of the proposition, Mohua Moitro.
I think I'm going to get a lot of flack from people in the audience as well as from my friends who will watch this debate, saying that we expected some fireworks, Mama, but this turned out to be a bit of a damn squib. So I apologize if that has been the case, but I will try and sum it up. Now, I was just trying to go through take some notes on what our speaker said, and in contrast to Dr. Roy, I think I'm not at that elevated position where I can kind of remember and just speak at the top of my head. I don't need to write it down. So I've written it down, and when I put it together, Mr. Roy says, Columbus ventured into uncharted territory. Just like to point out, actually, Columbus did not venture into uncharted territory. He was the first person who actually figured out the directional winds, when they blew from the east and when they flew from the west, which is why Columbus succeeded when nobody else had failed. So I think the very least that this government could have done is figured out which way the directional winds were before chartering out. It is completely incorrect to compare it to Columbus. It is not, again, as I said, that this is not a case of false bravado. As Mr. Hegde pointed out, there are times when you need to take calculated decisions, with information being the most valuable commodity, as a mythical character in investment banking once said in a very famous Wall Street movie. Information is the most valuable commodity, and as a government, we may not know everything, but it is up to us to make sure that we get resources and we speak to as many experts as possible before making any decision that is going to affect both the lives and the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people. Another thing that the opposition said was that lives have nothing to do with decisions. Lives have to do with the disease. And it is only livelihoods that had to do with the government. Again, I beg to differ. Like I said in my previous, when I spoke to you previously, was that when we see the number of lives lost, the 800 people that were walking home and died as a result of road accidents were not infected by corona. When I was met with the faces of hungry, desperate migrants after a 3-day journey home from Maharashtra into Bengal, when they got off, the first thing they said was, Didi, corona amader marbe na, khide amader marbe. Hunger will kill us, corona will not. We do not fear corona. And that is what was the reality for hundreds of millions of Indians. It was not the sort of hysteria that gripped a lot of the rich and the middle classes. The poor did not have the luxury of space. They did not have the luxury of physical distancing. And when we imposed a lockdown very early on without letting them go, it actually resulted in the complete opposite. Europe and the US had a peak for about 2.5 months. In India, the peak lasted for 7 months. because when we actually allowed the flow of migrants sometime in May, these were people who had by then stayed for 2 months in completely cramped spaces in metropolitan cities with no distancing, and the rate of infection was actually 4 times higher than it would have been had they come home in the first place. So again, the timing of the decision making was everything. It was not that a lockdown had to be imposed. Nobody is questioning that a lockdown had to be imposed, but as a government, you owed it to 30% of your working population who were the migrants. You owed it to 75% of your population who are poor to do something which affected all sections of society at the same time. One of the other things that we should remember is that people are talking of rates, that India is growing faster and we've recovered and unemployment is X and economic recovery is Y. I think one of the things we need to think about is that the Global Hunger Index was published in October, and the Global Hunger Index ranks India at 94 out of 107. It is below Sri Lanka, it is below Bangladesh, and it is below Pakistan. 70 years after independence, all of us want Poriborton, I'm sure. In some way or the other, all of us want Poriborton. But we have to make sure that we are not talking about parts of our anatomy. Thank you.
Thank you, and that brings us to the end of the debate, and there is just one formal responsibility that I have as a moderator to perform, and that is to put the motion to vote, before which it is customary to tell you a very brief summary of what you've already heard. And we've heard today a debate fundamentally between virologists and economists. The former suggesting that we should have shielded ourselves from the virus, the latter suggesting that we should have shielded ourselves from its economic impact. It has been a debate between those who believe in economics and those that believe in interactomics. And interactomics is the relationship between a viral gene and a human gene. It has been a debate between those who thought we should sacrifice our citizens to save our cities versus those who believe that we should have saved our economies but economized on our citizens' safety. It has been a debate between post-mortem pathologists who know what went wrong versus ante-mortem physicians who feel that everything went all right. It has been a debate between those who feel it is better to die in designer dress than to live in torn t-shirts. In fact, it has been a debate between morality and materialism in many ways, more than one. It has been a debate between which is more important, sense or the sensex. It has been a debate between living and livings. And English is a strange language. You can add on S and change whether you speak from the proposition or the opposition. But what is not debatable is the fact that all over the world, from the top of Capitol Hill to the bottom of the Calcutta plains, decisions about how to tackle the coronavirus has not been based on survival of populations or boosting of economies. It has been based on what inflates our political masters' vote banks. And I now leave you to decide whether you wish to side with team proposition on my right and say and believe that during the pandemic, India has failed to balance lives with livelihood. Those who side with team proposition, please raise your right hand. I said hand, not hands. And we could have somebody to try and count this. Okay. If you put your hands down and we get those that believe they would like to side with team opposition, raise your right hand. in spite of the glare of lights and the fact that the masks impede your vision, I think as moderator it would not be wrong if I felt that the audience here at the Calcutta Club thinks that the motion has carried. Congratulations to that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want everybody to kindly be seated. Please do not leave your seats, and request the speakers and the moderator to kindly be seated, because it's time to felicitate our honorable speakers and of course our amazing moderator. And for that, I would like to call on the First Lady of the Calcutta Club, Mrs. Kalyani Ghosh, to come on stage and felicitate speakers and moderator on behalf of the Calcutta Club. Ma'am. Ladies and gentlemen, I think a big hand. Come on, let's have some energy. And I think that's what the call of the day is. They say Calcutta is a warm-hearted city with an amazing punch. I want to hear that punch, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a beautiful evening, and I think there will be a wonderful audience, but please don't go anywhere. Still a lot to come, okay? And while ma'am is, of course, handing over the momentum, the appreciation on behalf of the Calcutta Club, I'd like to also invite on stage Mr. Dhruva Mukherjee, Deputy CEO, ABP Group, along with Ms. Bidisha Sarkar, Group Director, Subhas, Bose Institute, Hotel Management, to felicitate our honorable speakers. And to start off, I'd like them to felicitate Mr. Harshvardhan Neotia. And we have Mr. Prashanjit K. Basusa being felicitated by Bidisha. Of course, we have Mr. Dhruva Mukherjee, Deputy CEO, ABB Group, along. Next, we have Mr. Totagota Roy being felicitated, and Mr. Dhruva Mukherjee felicitating Mr. Prashanjit K. Basu. Thank you, Bidisha. Now I would request Mr. Raja Ghazi, Chairman of the Subhas Bose Institute of Hotel Management, to kindly come on stage. And along with Mr. Dhruva Mukherjee, felicitate our moderator, Dr. Sandeep Chatterjee. And of course, we have Mr. Raja Ghazi, Chairman, Subhas Bose Institute of Hotel Management, felicitating Mr. Sanjay Hedge, Mr. Kunal Sarkar, Dr. Kunal Sarkar, of course, the man who actually mends hearts, and of course Ms. Mahua Maitra. Thank you so much. It's been a very beautiful evening, and I'd request the speakers to kindly, and the moderator, to be on stage, and I'd like to invite Ms. Bidisha Sarkar, Mr. Raza Ghazi, Mr. Dhruva Mukherjee, Dr. Partha Sattwik Ghosh, the President, Ms. Kalyani Ghosh from Calcutta Club, and of course, Dr. Sandeep Chatterjee is there for a group photo on stage. We'd like Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a beautiful, beautiful evening, and You know, it would not have been possible. And of course, the Calcutta Club, the Telegraph National Debate 2021, presented by Subhas Bose Institute of Hotel Management, powered by Calcutta Business School, a unit of Sri Shikshatan Foundation, in association with Pan Bahar. Television news partner, ABP Ananda, radio partner, 91.9 Friends FM. Once again, thank you for joining. Please take care, stay safe, wear your masks, and be happy. That's the mantra of positivity. Good night and take care. And thank you once again, the honorable speakers and the moderator. It's been a splendid evening. Good night, take care, God bless, and please once again, stay safe.